Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm Heather Hayes, pastor at First Presbyterian Church here in Cedar Rapids, and I will be your moderator for this morning's program. Now, I'm going to date myself a little here, but I grew up in Cedar Rapids, and I remember years ago the little paper tickets that I would receive as part of the lunch program. So many punches for so many lunches. Some of my earliest memories are heading down into the basement of Kenwood Elementary School and hearing that click, click, click as my ticket was punched before you were heading into the lunchroom. Well, nowadays, things have changed. My daughters have IDs with a magnetic strip in the back that allow for them to debit their accounts, much like you would a debit card, and I can write a check for any amount that I want at any time, as well as getting online and making deposits. The times, they sure are changing. But one thing hasn't changed, and that is the need to deal with the problems that sometimes arise. Back in the days with those little lunch tickets, sometimes they would get lost or destroyed or sometimes even taken away. Nowadays, you have a situation where a child may go up to swipe their card and find out that their balance is zero. Today's panel will be talking about school lunch policy and disagreements as to what should be done when that lunch account balance goes to zero. With me on today's panel is Dr. Brandi Janssen, clinical assistant professor at the University of Iowa and director of Iowa's Center for Agricultural Safety and Health. Welcome, Brandi.
Thank you.
Next to Brandi is Todd Dorman, columnist for the Gazette and author of an article which created quite a stir around school lunches. Also, next to Todd is Lynda Waddington, also a columnist for the Gazette, who has been writing, among other things, about Iowa's school lunch policies for a number of months. So let's begin, maybe as we start off, with describing how some of the policy on lunch account balances stand now in the Cedar Rapids area. That would be for the Cedar Rapids School District, the College Community School District, the Linn-Mar District, and the Marion District. Do any of you want to jump in as to the policies that you know of in existence today?
Well, I can start. Each school district is allowed to set their own policy. Mm-hmm. They are not allowed to run a deficit with the school lunch program. So any school at the end of the year that does have a deficit with that program, they have to make it up out of the general fund. Okay. So what happens then is school districts are cracking down because their money is tight. Mm-hmm. You know, they don't want to pull money out of the general fund to cover the school lunch program. So some school districts feed children whatever. Some school districts have put different age groups of kids into different categories. So for instance, elementary school students always get fed something. Middle school students may be able to carry up to $10 deficit on their account. High school students, the minute they hit zero, it's over. You know, you're not having lunch. And middle school students generally will also get an alternate meal, even when their lunch account goes into deficit. So that would be your sun butter, which is the new peanut butter in this allergy world. But in Cedar Rapids, they have the last policy that I talked about. So elementary and middle can have alternates. They're fed. High school students, once you hit the cutoff point, you simply don't have lunch. Mm-hmm. And that sparked across the state of Iowa different parent groups, different teachers groups, and setting up what they're calling community meal accounts to make sure that kids in those schools are fed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So are you aware of how parents are informed or about when those account balances go lower or get close, or is it just a matter of the kid goes up there, finds out there's no money, and then has to?
No, the school districts are trying to be more communicative with the parents. So emails, text messages, whatever they have at their disposal, they are using to try to keep parents informed.
Okay. So, Todd, can you briefly describe your experience or your family's experience with the low account balance for those who are listening this morning who may not have read your column in the Gazette?
Yeah, we have a family account at Lynmar, and so we have a middle school student and a high school student. And at Lynmar, middle school students are allowed to go $15 over their account, so they do get some leeway. High school students aren't. And so what happened at the end of September was my wife had budgeted for the month. The middle schooler had gone over budget. She had gotten an email notice saying that the account was negative. There was a lot of stuff going on. She's a working mother. She's got lots of things to do. I should probably help out more. And so it was one of the things that just fell by the wayside. She didn't recharge the account. So on the following Monday, when my daughter went to get lunch, she went with her tray of lunch, went to pay for it. It was a negative balance. And at Lynmar, what happens then is the student's told they can't have lunch. Their lunch is dumped. And so that was sort of a shock to her. We were sort of vaguely aware of the policy, but we weren't aware that the lunch was just, summarily dumped. And which I wrote a column basically arguing that I thought that was sort of wasteful, and also argued that because this was a parental mistake and not a student mistake, I wasn't sure whether that was the right way to approach the problem. And then I proceeded to get a lot of parenting advice from readers. So we can maybe get into that later, but it's a policy that I believe is sort of a model policy that a lot of school districts are adhering to, but not all. And lots of districts do give high school students even some leeway with a few meals or $15 or $25. And Lynmar's account deficit at the end of last year was $8,000, which within the scope of a $2 or $3 million nutrition program didn't seem like, to me at least, the sort of deficit or the sort of problem that necessitated that kind of abrupt sort of tough punishment for the student not getting lunch and having it dumped and going through sort of the embarrassment of that.
Well, and you've started touching on, I was going to say, that doesn't sound like, I know my daughters in that kind of, especially freshman, sophomore, trying to make their way through high school, they'd be, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening to me. Everybody knows, slink back to the table, try to get some chips from a friend. That's not an ideal situation for them, and I'm sure it's not an ideal situation for the school. Let's talk a little bit about some of the downsides of this policy, and you've already sort of mentioned some of them. Anyone want to hop in on that?
Well, I think the biggest thing is just, if we have students who are going to school and those students are hungry, they are not learning. That's the biggest downside that there is. We can have the best teachers, we can have the best computers, we can have the most incredible facilities, the best textbooks. But if those students are hungry to a point where they can't concentrate, all of that is for naught. So I think that's the biggest downside to this policy. We should have well-fed students who are ready to learn.
Well, and there's sort of a closed customer base. I mean, my daughter there wasn't any other option. I mean, she was going to have lunch at school with her card or not have lunch. I mean, so, was it a huge deal for her? I mean, I think she's a pretty resilient kid. She understood what happened. But my point is that this is a situation where it seems to me there just has to be a more appropriate way to sort of drive home the fact to parents that they need to pay these bills other than sort of not serving their children lunch and dumping, perfectly good food. I guess that was part of what I wrote, was that I don't understand what's being saved. I mean, she had I think it was a $1.92 account deficit, and so then they dumped like $4 worth of food. And I'm not sure how that's that's a good business model.
Okay. So now let's move on to some of the challenges that districts face. Brandi, Brandi, could you speak to any of those issues?
Yeah, I think some. So most of my experience working with nutrition directors has come from implementing farm-to-school programs and sort of thinking about fresh foods in the lunch context. And what I've learned in working with food service directors is just the enormous number of constraints that they face. So most food service programs are separate from the general operating budgets of the districts. These are people who are basically running their own businesses. And they often have to advocate for themselves for school districts, at the school board level. There are lots of firms that could take over a school district's food service program, and most food service directors who manage those would prefer that not to happen because they would like to keep their place of employment. So they're often having to prove that their job is not to be profitable, but they also, as was pointed out, they also can't really show a loss. So I'm sympathetic that in even a relatively small deficit, that they want to sort of make that up. The extent to which the strategies for doing that are different. I think that's kind of what our focus is today. But certainly even small deficits can look sort of as to be a major issue to a school district. And that is in addition to all of the bid requirements that they have to fulfill, the calorie requirements with the new Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. Now, when you're serving vegetables, you're serving them you have to make sure that you serve an orange vegetable and not too many white vegetables. And so they're juggling an awful lot of things, and often in complicated districts where food is getting trucked around. Not every school maybe has a production kitchen, so if in the case of a deficit, can they take cash to make up for it? Not always, because sometimes they're bringing food in and just a staff person with a computer to enter their number in. So they're really complicated systems, and I think that's one of the challenges with trying to find a policy that works, that isn't unfair to kids, but makes sure that the system remains viable.
And Todd, you've already mentioned that as you spoke to the Lynn-Mar district, they were running an $8,000 deficit. And I think, Lynda, at a different column that you had written, they were talking about Iowa City's was around $35,000.
Yeah, I think that was last year.
That
or
was
the year
last
before.
year's, okay, or
Yeah.
the year before. And that, are you aware of ways other than what seems that the Cedar Rapids area school districts have similar policies, differing amounts of how low an account can go or not go? Are you aware of different ways in which other districts have handled this across Iowa?
As far as
As far as trying to balance the school budget, or the lunch budget.
my kids go to school in Marion, which Lynn-Mar and Marion kind of split Cedar Rapids, Marion, that area. We don't have an issue with deficits in Marion. My kids get fed. So I think in our district, I think it came down to that commitment and that priority, that we were going to take care of these kids and that we weren't going to shame them for something, honestly, they really have no control over. Mm-hmm. And the kids, for those who wonder, the kids really do see it as shaming. This peanut butter or sun butter or cheese sandwich or whatever, it is the sandwich of shame when they talk about this happening to them. Oh, no, you got the sandwich of shame. So your lunch account, was in the red and everyone knows it. Mm-hmm. And I guess for an adult, maybe that doesn't seem like a big deal. But for a kid, when you're going with peer pressure and you're kind of at that point in your life, it really is a big deal.
Yeah, and my problem isn't really with the people that have to carry out this policy, the people working in the lunchroom, mm-hmm. the folks who run the nutrition program. It's really with the policymakers, especially the elected school board members. I mean, what I found in Lynn-Mar, as I looked through meeting minutes and things, was that this policy was among 20 policy changes lumped together with no explanation on a school board agenda. According to the meeting minutes, it wasn't one. A couple of those policies were discussed by the school board, but not that policy. So this change, there wasn't really much opportunity given for much, parent input. Mm-hmm. It was passed without discussion, but part of a long list of things they passed on a single night. The minutes aren't posted online until they've been approved at the next meeting, so by the time anyone would have known about it, it had already been approved twice and was a done deal. Now, they did inform parents after the fact, before the school year, that this policy was in place, but my argument is, why not, why adopt this policy without giving parents and other members of the community a chance to sort of weigh in on the possibility of figuring out something other than dumping kids' lunch?
And to go a little bit further with, it seems to me there can be two different scenarios in why a lunch account goes into the red. One would be like, for example, my children they have had an issue with that at one point in time, and I will never live that down. And that was completely parental oversight. But as I was preparing for this and talking with some others in the community, one of the concerns that was brought up was that there are individuals in the school district who get free lunches or reduced lunches, but there is always that little that cutoff line of families that are a little bit out of that range, who may really have a financial struggle to, if a middle schooler doubles up a few days, all of a sudden they are not able to cover those extra costs in a way that some other parents are. So it can, I think, there is a kind of a serious nature to the discussion too. Would any of you have any sense of, in terms of what percentage is just parental oversight versus what percentage might be people who are chronically unable to cover lunch expense costs?
That's a good question. I think I don't off the top of my head, but I think looking at each, because these policies are often set by building, and we know that neighborhoods tend to feed into schools, and so we know that levels of poverty, for example, if you have a high level of free and reduced lunch, there are probably also lots of families that fall into that category where they're just over the line. Yeah. And so if thinking about what school boards can do is maybe thinking about it in a little bit more finely tuned way and think, well, are there different strategies for buildings? Because is it just that, we didn't reload the lunch account, which has happened to a lot of us.
Yes, I know.
It does happen. Or is this, indicative of a neighborhood that, is lower income and as collectively, does the community think this is something it's important to invest in to make sure that kids are fed?
So, Todd, at the end of your article, one of the things that you mentioned was that perhaps it's time to talk a little bit about different options for solutions. Maybe over lunch. We don't have any lunch here in front of us here this morning, but I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the solutions. Lynda, I know you talked about in the Boone district, I believe, there was a group of teachers that came up with something. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, in the Boone district, they had a fairly significant deficit that had to be covered, and reacted with fairly strict access to school lunches or running deficits on school lunch accounts. But then teachers who were seeing the kids who didn't have time to eat set up snack closets. In addition, one of the parents worked with the teachers to set up a community lunch account. So anytime a student was running, a deficit, they could then automatically just turn over and pull from that community account. And the last that I heard on that, I think they had gathered about $1,200 to start with that community lunch account, but that was late last winter, so I don't know exactly where they are on that now.
That process.
Iowa City, I think there's actually a food pantry in one of the high schools. They send home backpacks of food with some children who they know to be at risk of hunger. There have been a lot of ways the community has stepped up. And going back to Todd's point, that's what makes it kind of sad when you have these policies go into effect without that larger conversation. Because I don't think anyone in any of our communities really wants to see our kids, whether they be 15 or 6, go to school when they're hungry.
I know, and I was trying to find the link to that again. I think, and I don't know if it was related to anything that came about because of your article, Todd, but there's a woman who is working on putting together something for, I think it's the Cedar Rapids school districts, kind of that same account that could be drawn from for kids who come up and their balance is zero, so they don't lose their lunch. And I believe you had somebody give a donation.
I had a reader hand me a check, basically saying that they wanted that to go to Lynn-Mar to set up some sort of account to feed into those when the account balance goes negative. So yeah, I mean the community involvement is, that's one solution, because it's a community school district, so that makes sense.
So in one sense, I would call this almost like a private funding or a private supplementing option. There's some pros to that, but what are the cons?
Well, I think if we want elected officials to step up and take responsibility for these systems, then when we start funding it privately, we lose some of that investment. So I think it's incredibly generous, and but what do we want the school lunch program to be? Do we want our districts to invest in it, or do we want to expect private citizens to invest in it? And I think that's a conversation that any district should have that would be in this situation.
Well, I think the Des Moines Register editorial board opined that basically their position was that school lunch should be free for every student, and I forget what the number was that was assigned to that. It was fairly large, but they were saying basically this is an integral part of the educational experience. You pay for all the other necessities, books and computers and all of those things. Having a well-balanced lunch is part of that. I heard from at least a couple families after my column that talked about how they were sort of in that gap area where they were not eligible but also not wealthy, and they had students who were in extracurricular activities that required them to come to school at 6 in the morning for practice, and then they didn't get lunch, and then they had practice after school until 5 or 6 o'clock at night. That's 12 hours without anything to eat, and so. That's a significant problem. I'm sure that's not a huge group of students, but it's enough that should be addressed.
Yeah, and I think on the federal level we are seeing some movement. The school lunch program has been under USDA for, 4 or 5 decades now, and we've seen it, shift as the years go by. And what they introduced fairly recently was the CEP program, Community Eligibility Provision, I think is what the alphabet soup stands for. And what that means is when you have a school building, and within that school building, 40% of those students are receiving free lunches. The idea is that's probably an impoverished neighborhood, or so other students are on those thresholds. So when that happens, that school can become a CEP school, and every student in that school receives lunches. There's no paperwork. None of this other kind of hassle on getting those free and reduced. It's just automatic. So, and I happen to agree with the Register. I think this should be a priority. If we're going to say that we have to have textbooks, that we have to have computers, that we need football fields and libraries and all of these other things that we want our kids to use, we ought to give them the fuel to be able to use them.
One of the things, again, as I was doing some research for this morning's program, I was surprised to find out with the paperwork component at the beginning of the school year that it's actually there are many more individuals and families that qualify for free or reduced lunches that just don't go through or slip through the cracks in terms of all the different steps they need to take to be able to receive that benefit. So I guess that would sort of speak to or ease that pinch point with the CEP.
Yeah, and if you think about it, you think about the shaming factor on kids who ultimately can't refill their school lunch accounts generally. It's a parental issue. You think about we want all the kids in our school to go to their fullest potential. And when you look at all of those things that we want to accomplish and all of the negatives with the policies that we have now, this kind of mishmash, just feeding the students seems to be the most simple answer that we could have, and make the investment and do it. And That's the policy I'd like to see across Iowa.
That sounds like a wonderful idea. What kinds of issues do you think would come up? What would have to happen to make that a possibility? Just the political will?
Well, and keep the National School Lunch Program is the National School Lunch Program, so that it would require a change at the federal level.
At the federal level, okay.
So all those funds get dispersed through the states, but the states do not have oversight of the program. They simply process, the Departments of Ag and the Departments of Education work together to manage them at the state level, but all the funding decisions are made at the Farm Bill level.
Okay.
Just to overcomplicate it a little bit more.
Of course.
But could school districts now just allow the deficits to accumulate and cover them as they're doing?
I believe so.
I mean, they
the
don't
district
have to
can make
wait
that
on
decision. Mhm.
Yeah, they don't have to wait on the federal
Yep.
government if they just wanted to. We're going to pay this.
Sure. And not all school districts have to participate in the National School Lunch Program. That's another. It's a choice to participate.
Oh, okay. So what are the other options then for a school district?
Well, then they could fund something themselves, or parents could manage it themselves. But I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. Now that I've said that, most schools do, but it's not like it's a requirement that you have to participate. If you are in it, though, then you have to follow the requirements of it, which are stringent, and they cause some of these complicating factors, of what gets served and calories and serving sizes and all of those sorts of things. But.
And what counts as a vegetable?
What counts as a vegetable,
What counts
which
as a
is
vegetable?
we've disagreed about over time, apparently. So.
Yes, I hear about that too. Why there has to be so much broccoli on the plate?
Well, because you have to have a green vegetable every
You
week,
do,
and
you do.
lettuce only goes so far. Some they do like to mix it up, lettuce or broccoli.
Yeah.
Limited choices.
Or green beans.
Green beans.
Green
right.
beans are a favorite. Yes. Well, we haven't solved anything here this morning, but I hope we've added or begun to add to a broader conversation that will continue at state and local levels. It's difficult to, and I think, Brandi, you especially have brought that to the table. It's difficult to create and fund policies that will address the very wide needs of students who are each individuals with their own individual gifts and their own individual challenges and their own individual food needs. I think we can all agree, however, that whether we be at the state, the local, the national level, whether we are parents or just members in the community, that the health and welfare of our children and youth are an important priority. And so I think I want to thank you all for this discussion and for your participation this morning. And I would also like to thank you, our audience, for watching us here today. So on behalf of the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, thank you for being here. Tune in next week for more issue-based discussion. Take care and have a wonderful day.